create a new project. So file, new project, project. And now we're going to be creating a .NET Standard library again, but we're going to actually using good coding practices for this .NET Standard library. So we're going to do the .NET Standard library. And this is going to be enter for intermediate notification. All right. Now this is actually going to be dependent on a lot of SQL stuff. So remember when I said I would actually paste in some stuff for how to do it? Here's where. So if you look here, we've got our create table, which I'm pasting in the chat now. So we're going to be, well, first we need to actually come in here and add the table to our database. So you come into the database, you right click here, new database, and for this purpose, I called it notification. Then under security, logins, you're going to have the notification user we're going to create as well. So let's first start with creating the notification database. You create the database, it'll create this out. And then you're going to come in here and you're going to do new query. And to create our credentials table, you're going to paste in this stuff here. And our notification types table. Credentials is where we're going to be storing our server information, our SMTP information, user login, all that. Whenever using any framework, make sure you have a primary key and it is an identity. It just makes it so it can map easily. Otherwise, you can still do it without the key. It just gets a little annoying. And then for our notification types, we're going to do that. So both of those create those given tables, which after you've created them, you'll see here, this is a basic format for them. Now, for entering your credentials, I'm not going to give you a script. You're going to need to enter your own, but all you're going to do is edit the top 200 rows of this, and you can click on the top row, enter your information as needed. Pay attention to spacing and all that, because it will matter. You can have an extra space at the end of the SQL Server, and unless you remember to trim that space out on the string, it's going to have an issue. All right, so you create those, you create your notification types, and then this script here, let me go ahead and paste these two guys over into the chat. And I'll be adding them to the description of the YouTube video whenever we create it. So those two create tables will handle that. Now this is the meat and potatoes. This is actually doing everything from that website I sent in the knowledge base, the Team Unify. This will insert all these different cell phone providers and their email to SMS. So we got everything from people I have no idea who they are, like Cellcom, no idea. You got Charter, you got Verizon, you got all of them. This will insert those into that table. And if you can actually select the top 10,000 rows here. Ooh, crap. I'm going to have to delete this video. Oh, or, yeah. Anyway. That's why you got to be careful where you're clicking. So you select the top 10,000 rows here. And you'll notice they're all in here. And I'll go ahead and paste that into the chat. Exceeds the maximum characters, so I will add it to the description at a later date. And I need to clip out or edit that one clip, but that's okay. So we've got this piece here, which added all of those people in. Our next step is we're going to add a user, so you're going to just come down to the security for your database table, new. You're going to create a new login. It's going to be SQL Server authentication. You're going to create the user. I'm going to call it notification user, which is what I already did. And you can set the password to whatever you want. And the big thing is you want to change your default database to your notification database. And you want to switch your server roles. There we go. User mappings. and you want to give it access to the notification, and you want to give it data writer, data reader. You really don't need to do data writer. Data writer, though, will let it write to it if you decide to add in the ability to add additional pieces through this. After you create the user and you have the password, we're done in SQL Server for now, so we're going to go ahead and close out of this. We're not going to bother saving those. And we're back into this piece. Oop. So, now we're going to actually set up some folder structures here. We're going to get rid of this basic class again. And we're also going to worry a little bit about making items inaccessible externally to avoid people being able to access pieces that we don't want them to access. We want them to rely on our main interface to come into here. We don't want them accessing all of our different internal methods. There shouldn't be a need to call our factories or the majority of our services from external applications, so we want to make sure those are segregated. So first, let's go ahead and come in here. We're going to go ahead and add a new folder. We're going to call this one data. Add new folder. Context. All right, so that context folder is where we're going to store our database context for any framework. Add new folder models. These are going to be our database models. Let's real quick go into properties on this and make sure we're in .NET Framework. We want to go 2.1, and why we want to go to 2.1 is 2.1 allows us to apply data annotations directly to the class using nullable, which lets us keep our context case relatively simple while allowing us to actually specify each different model attribute. So we've got that part set up. Next, we're going to have the models that we're using throughout this. So we're going to have internal models for this. So we're going to do another models folder. And these are going to be the models that are local to the application. Then we're going to add a new folder for our factories. We're only going to really have one factory in here, but the factories folder is where you put all your stuff that are going to build your different objects. Then add new folder, and we got our services, which is going to be where all of our different services are stored. And last thing, since this is a library and we want to handle all the dependency injection for this library inside the library itself, we're going to add a module folder, which is where we're going to store the module that will handle our DI for this. So add new folder module. All right. Now that we've got the folders in, we're going to go ahead and add some stuff here. We're going to manage NuGet packages. Browse. And as it says, this DI is going to be done using autofac, which is a dependency injection setup. Autofac right there. We're going to install that. And we're going to install the dependency injection. Microsoft is pretty good at recognizing their own stuff, so we're going to see if it'll just pick up what we're trying to do with the rest of it. So we've got that. As I pasted in those two models, and you should have them available in the chat, where we've got the credentials and the notification types, we're going to go to model. We're going to actually add a class. And this is going to be named Credentials. All right. So I'm going to set this to public. We're going to keep the majority of the rest of the items inside here as internal. It just had autofac can have difficulty associating the items if the constructor isn't public. And in this case, if the models that the constructor relies on aren't public. So this is going to be this model correlates to the credential database. All right. right. Now here's a little trick here. So most of you know that there's a lot of different types of strings and all that available. The first issue with strings, though, is by default they are nullable. So for us to be able to specify that it's not null in the database and correctly map it, we need to specify not null. We have to set it up where the string can't be null. To do that, we're just going to add hashtag nullable enable. After we do that, we're going to come down here and we're going to do our first piece, which is the ID of our database model. So you've got public int ID get set, which is just a getter setter, allows the model to be written to and pulled from. Now here we're going to use some data annotations. First is key. The key will say that this is our primary database key for this given table for EntityFramework. So we come in here, and if you look right here, we've got install system component data annotations, which is what we want to do. So we're going to find install latest version, and now our key works. The next thing we need to do for this to map correctly to EntityFramework is we need to specify what type of column it is. So we go column, column. Come on. Sometimes when you don't have the stuff imported yet, it can try to figure out what you're typing, and it can be a real pain. So there's the next piece we're going to need using the data annotation schema, which recognizes column. Now, if you come in here, the name of the column inside of our database is ID, with a capital I. And then we're going to specify the type of it. By doing this, it allows us to use types that wouldn't normally be recognized for that given specific item as that. It's a specific casting to that type. So we're going to do type name equal to. And our column, our identity column is an int. So we got that guy there. And this just corresponds to the primary key ID of the table. And that is mad because I forgot to end the param. There we go. All right. And I am a big copy paster. We've written this once. We don't need the key for anything else. There's only one primary key for the table. But we can use the format for column. And this time we're going to do our username, which is a string. Now here's the big thing. As I said from the start, strings are by default nullable, but we can say specifically that this string, because it's not null in our table, cannot be null by doing null not. So now this username is notated as it cannot be null from our database. So this username is now required as far as all that goes. The big thing here then is to actually make sure you map your type correctly. So this is an in varchar, and it is 1024. And this is not corresponds to the username of the table. This is this corresponds to the username column of the table. Perfect. All right. So now we've got username set up there. I did not null for all these because you don't, well, I don't personally need a username without a password or a missing SMTP because I'm going to be relying on all those for the configurations. So we got password. Our password, we only set it to 250 characters. If you actually have a 250 character password that you use, good for you. Kudos. Password. And now we've got that mapping complete. Again, we've got the equal to not null because password is a required attribute. Come down here. We then have our server aspect, which is what our SMTP server is stored in. So we've got server here. Again, we're just doing 250. Servers normally don't exceed that, I hope, but You can change that on your actual column creation. Just make sure you match the type name to the actual type of it. So this is the server column from the table. And the last one we have is the port. So we need the port that our SMTP server is going to use. So we got port here. Port. If you do happen to have a nullable on any of these items, if you want to have your port null or your server null, the way to do null is to just put a question mark there and you get rid of this not equal. That denotes nullable. Again, you can actually use the nullable for anything that is not nullable by default anywhere as far as applications go. So if you want to do int nullable, make sure you check that it's not null, because you can't explicitly assign an int to, well, int from a nullable int unless you actually cast it to an int. So there's our port. Type name int. We're missing the bracket on our column name there. There we go. And spacing will trigger me like no tomorrow. And this corresponds to the port from our table. And I missed the C, but whatever. I really need to turn down the sensitivity of this mouse. Alright, there we go. Alright. So now we actually have our credential set up as far as EntityFramework goes. We need to add the next model, which is going to be our notification types. So we come in here, we have notification types. There we go. All right. And we're actually going to do some copy paste real quick. We're going to need all the same data annotations, everything that we use for this first model and the second one. So we're just going to copy these here, and we're going to just replace the using statements for this. Again, we're going to make this public so autofac can access it. We come down here. This is going to be the... Again, I am really bad. I will copy and paste most things, just to make sure that they match, they look uniform. So this model is going to correlate to the notification types table from the database. Notification types table from the database. So again, we're actually going to copy some of these here as well, just so we have the basics so we can copy and paste inside this and get it all set up. We did ID the same for this one, so this is actually going to just stay ID, because ID is the exact same for both tables. However, we didn't do username for our thing. We actually have a notification type. So we've got notification type here. And that is an invarchar of 100. And we'll just paste that up there. Paste that there. And again, we did not nullable for that. Next, you have your email format, which is just how we're going to format the end of the email to be able to actually send the SMS messages. So your email format. And for this one, we did 250 just in case somebody went really excessive for the end. I highly doubt you ever end up needing 250 characters for it, but it was just a safe one. Then we're going to go to, last thing, whether or not this particular notification type can accept HTML. So we're going to do paste. Oop. And we're actually going to, oh darn it. There we go. All right. And this one's going to be called accepts HTML. And we're going to use a type of bit here. Because we said it's a bit. Bit's just a way of doing a bool as far as the database goes. And because a bool is by default not null, we don't need this piece here. And we're actually going to change this to bool to correspond to our bit. All right. So there's that setup. So we now have our models built for the database. We're going to save those. Now we're going to go ahead and add our database context. So we're going to go ahead and create a new class. This is going to be notification context for our database context for the notification table. Add. All right. So this is where we're going to start limiting access. So we're going to set this to internal, which means only items internal to this given application can access this class. Internal partial, notification context. The next piece is to actually set it up as a DB context, which is just saying, hey, this is an EntityFrameworkCore context. And since I didn't add that NuGet originally, we're going to now use quick action refactoring to install Microsoft EntityFrameworkCore. We've got that added. Context. We're connecting to the notification database. All right. So this is the part where autofac requires that public constructor. So we're going to do public notification context. DB context options. Oops. And this is going to be notification context again. Space options. Enter. Oop. I actually forgot my brackets. There we go. We're not actually going to put anything in there. That's just setting the options context for us. Actually, I think there's supposed to be a ... base. Yeah. I missed that. ... Almost completely forgot this. There we go. There we go. So, database context, options, constructor for our notification context. All right. Next, we're going to actually set our items in here. By doing what we did as far as those data annotations, we can actually do internal, virtual, DB set that to the notification types, which is going to be mad at us all the way up until we add a using for it, which we're just going to do via our IntelliSense. And it's going to recommend we use that, which we will, and then get and set. DB set for notification types. All right. Then we're going to do the next one, which is going to be internal virtual again. Virtual classes just means it's not actually instantiated at that point. It needs to be instantiated elsewhere, which will be handled by our dependency injection and the models. The internal, again, is the limiter to the access, so things from outside of our application cannot access this. Oop. Credentials. All right. So that handles our database context aspects. Now, I'm actually going to create a service now for interacting with those. So we're going to do IDBService because we're going to set up an interface, which will handle calling out to the database. So we're going to do an internal interface. An interface is just basically a template for it, or a contract for the implementation of code. It doesn't actually implement the code itself, but it gives the structure to it, and it's used primarily by other services to reference it without actually having to directly construct. Interfaces are really crucial as far as dependency injection goes for being able to set up, connect to different services, and honestly, replace services on the fly is the primary goal here. Delegate factories are by far one of the coolest things as far as dependency injection I've used. So this here is the service wrapping interactions with the database. Perfect. So we got that piece. All right. So now we actually need to go to our models. And I'm actually going to add a new folder. And we're going to create a services inside of our model for models related to our services. And then we're going to have to create some things that go across, which for this one, we're actually going to create a class credential model. This model will be used for how our program is going to handle credentials, because we're not going to use the database models for everything. We just want to use the credential model. This credential model is going to be internal to our program, so it can't be accessed externally. And we're going to use the majority of the stuff from this, but we're going to go ahead and cut out the ID because we don't care about the ID. We'll also have to change all the comments on this, but that's okay. And we're going to set all these to internal. And let's get rid of that. So this holds port. Let's first come up with a good thing. Credentials for credentials object for interacting with SMTP. Holds port information for SMTP. We're not making as nullable, so there's no point in having that there. We're just going to do a normal string. Hold server information for SMTP. There we go. Go. All right, and this is going to hold our holds password for SMTP, and this holds our user for the SMTP. Holds user for SMTP. All right, so that's pieces ready. So that actually will hold our credentials. We now need a notification type model, so we're going to create that one next. Type. I didn't mean to create it there, so let's go ahead and get rid of that one. Need to create that because we're going to be using that in multiple locations, so it doesn't make sense to assign it to a root folder. Well, it makes sense to assign it to the root folder. There we go. So notification types, type model, add. And very similar, we're going to be using a lot of the same stuff here, but we're going to not worry about the ID. Since ID was set up to auto-increment, even if we were using these models to pass data into this, you wouldn't need the ID. It would automatically create that for you. The only time you'd need the ID would be if you were doing a update to it, where you'd need the identifier to be able to find it. But you can snag the model based off the notification type, assuming it's unique, or one of the other attributes. Again, purely assuming it's unique. Otherwise, you're going to have issues where you're going to have to try to couple together data and you have no real unique identifier, but yeah. So object information on notification types. There we go. All right. So This notification type is type of notification available to send. Email format is the formatting for the email we're going to be sending. Adding for setting email type. Let's go ahead and add some stuff here for just additional information. Verizon, email, T-Mobile, Etsy. There we go. And this here is just whether or not email can have HTML markup. All right, so we've got that done. Now here's where we're going to add an explicit setup for that given DbService. We're going to go ahead and create a new class, and this is going to follow the request response pattern. So we're going to have GetCredentials request and GetCredentials response. All right. Both these are going to be internal because they should only be used inside of our application. We don't want anything interacting with the DbService outside of our application again. That is not the primary point of contact. So we've got our GetCredentials request, and this is a request object for getting credential. So the point of the request object in this case, we're not actually going to fill it with any data, but the object itself is going to be utilized to hold, well, it encapsulates, one second. It encapsulates the variable where, for instance, if you decide to add some logic to the request, you can just modify that object and you don't have to change how the calls are made. So we've got our response class, so internal response for getting credentials. Now here's the big thing of the response object. We absolutely have some stuff to fill in here. First is we have an internal bool, and that's going to be success, which is, did we succeed, yes or no? Indicator whether operation was a success. Next, we're actually going to do an internal list of errors. So in the event we didn't exceed, we want to know what failed. Internal list string errors. Get set. List of errors. The last thing we're going to want is our credentials. So we created that model for holding the credentials, so we're going to go ahead and do an internal list again. This allows for multiple credentials because we actually called it GetCredentials response. So we're not looking at a singular object here. So we have the credential model, and credentials. Get set. Oop. There we go. All right, and this is a list of found credentials. Perfect. All right. So there is our response object set up. We've got a request object set up. So now we come to our database service here. And we're going to do GetCredentials response. And GetCredentials And let's go ahead and go to our IntelliSense real quick, which is going to say, hey, you need to include this using statement, which is exactly what we want. And this is going to be the GetCredentials request. We're going to add our XML comments here. So method for getting credential from the database. Request. That's going to be our credentials to get. Ooh. Ah, sorry about that. There we go. I'm having issues with my OBS right now. There we go. Sorry about that. There we are. All right. So getting your credentials from the database. The GetCredentials request is the request with information on what credentials to get. Perfect. And then returns. So this will return success with list of credentials or error. Thank you for whoever just followed. I appreciate it. All right. Next, we're going to handle our request and response as far as our notification. So we're going to do a get notification types request. Class and get notification types response. Same deal, internal only. And this is the object. Oh, there we go. Response object. We're getting notification types. There we are. And this is actually going to be very similar to our credential request here, which is just going to have a list of notification types instead. But the errors are all the same. So we're going to switch this out to the notification type model. And that is now going to be notification types. List of found notification types. Perfect. All right. Let's go on to the request. This is again going to be internal here. Request. Object for getting notifications. And again, I'm going to leave this empty. For right now, we're just going to return all of our notification types. We're going to come back to the database service. And we are going to do a get notification response. This is get notification types. And we're going to do our request, set our request. Method for getting notifications types from database. All right, request with information on what notifications to get. Success with list of notifications or error. All right, now we've got our interface built out. Now let's go ahead and implement our interface real quick. So we're just going to create a new class again. This is going to be DbService. Internal class, DbService. And by doing IDBService, and then we can utilize the implement interface to create it out for us. We're not going to worry about the fact it's throwing public there. The public is required for autofac to be able to recognize it, but the internal DB class itself makes it so it can't be accessible external. So, yeah. All right. Now we're going to be lazy and we're going to copy pasta. That's the whole point of not saying interface here, is I can just copy this over and do the same for these pieces here. Please, 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 if you're working with other people, comment your code. Even just doing this will make a world of difference for the poor guy who has to work on it after you. Just throwing that out there as a PSA. All right. Now, so something to notice, especially when doing Service Fabric, EntityFrameworkCore does not like to play nice. As a result, we're going to create owned instances where we control the scope of our database context for it. As a result, by doing it this way, we can close out the database scope and open the database scope whenever we're needing to, versus relying it to handle it itself, which will result in some errors, trying to do some mass reads, mass writes type of deal with it. For people who are new to the idea of Service Fabric is set up where you have multiple instances hosted across multiple servers functioning as one single application that any single application can send to. All right. So with that in place, we're going to first do private read-only, because there is no reason to make these attributes available to anything outside. We're going to set up a func. It's going to be an own func. And it's going to be our notification context. And we're going to use some IntelliSense here. That handles that piece. And now here's our autofac owns instance, which is basically saying that inside this application, this particular method is going to handle owning the actual instance of this. So this is going to be our instance of the notification context that's getting passed in. All right. And now we're going to set up our constructor. Nope. Helps if I give it a name. So, context. All right. Next, we're going to create the public constructor for this. Again, it just has to be public so autofac can access it, but it's still going to be internal to our program. DbService. And we need to set up our func owned here. So we're actually just going to copy and paste this in. And I missed the F on func. I really need to adjust this mouse sensitivity. Really good for gaming. Really, really bad for actually being able to handle that. And we're going to set that to context. There we go. And then we're going to set our context equal to the context we're passing in. So this right here is going to pass in our autofac context, catches it into this context, and lets it be usable throughout this application on the. And this is a constructor for database service context, and that is our passed in dependency for notification context. Perfect. All right. So now that we've got that, we're going to set these up so they are reliable, but they're reliable in a unique way. So I like to actually rely on throwing exceptions to pass errors that are happening inside of my try or validation errors outside of it. So what we're first going to start out doing is we're going to create our object here. If you bomb on creating an object, there is something really wrong with your code. So normally this creation is fairly safe. New. And we're going to instantiate our different items inside of this. So errors equal to new list string. Doing this will stop it from you. If you try to go and add errors, add an error without doing that piece first, it'll throw because error was never initialized. So you're initializing the internal components. Again, we're going to say we failed until we succeed. So success is false from the start. And our credentials is equal to a new list of our credentials. All right. Return response. Now, the rest of our code is actually going to function inside of a try-catch. This will let it actually fail reliably. So instead of having to worry about an exception bombing out of this class, we're going to catch those exceptions and actually control what response is passed back out. Now, since we are controlling what we're passing back out, we need to make sure that we add the exception that was generated to our errors, which again is why we initialized our errors up here. So we got our errors dot add exception. We're actually going to be using some reflection here in dot dots. So this dots get type. So this will give us the class name, dot name. So it should say, hey, I was in DbService. And I forgot the plus. By the way, whenever you're making a string add together like this, you need the pluses to be able to say, hey, there's something that's coming next. Otherwise, it's an error. So we've got our plus there. We're going to do that. We're going to get our method here. Method base dot. And this will give us the name of this method. What we're trying to do right now is be lazy and create something where we can copy this across to multiple try catches and be able to have it just easily available. So now we need to actually quick action refactor, and it should be using system reflection so we can actually get information from our method we're in. Dot name. Dot name. Perfect. Now then, we're going to move on to the last piece of this, which is, hey, we want the actual exception. So our exception space exception equal to space plus, and then we're just going to ex.toString, which just toStrings our exception, where it'll be a string value of what our exception was. And now we have added that to our response, so in the event we trigger an exception inside, it's going to tack on whatever that exception was to our response object and pass it out. Which is really all we're needing for that piece. And we're actually going to be doing this here, copying this down, because this is going to be our basic format we're using throughout all of this, where we're going to create a response object, and then inside the try catch, implement the logic. Inside the catch, we're just going to snag any errors and pass those through. There we go. So now we've updated this, and just like that, our response object doesn't need change. That's the idea of making it generic enough you can copy it over. So now we've got that piece set up. Let's go ahead and go in here, and we're going to actually handle using this. So first, we need to create a list of objects that we're going to be passing into. So in this case, we're actually going to be using a list of our data models. And this is our credentials, so credentials. And we're going to call this credentials equal to new list. New list. Perfect. All right. So now we're actually going to use a using statement here. So the using statement is going to be our scope in which our database contacts lives. The reason we create this model outside is we're going to assign it inside of our using statement and then terminate our using statement. So we're just briefly open to the database, but not for a second longer than we gotta be. Or probably a millisecond in all honesty. So we're gonna have our notification context, not context, equal to underscore context. So we've now assigned our notification context there. And I'm actually going to come up here real quick using... I don't like doing these myself, but for some reason it does not like... Well, whenever I was building my test applications earlier, it wouldn't let me use this. So we're going to use system link. So link here is going to enable us to actually make our database call that we're needing. So we've got our credentials object that we created here, and we instantiated it. And we're actually going to pull from our database now using the link. So we've got our from statement, and this is going to be our cred in, and we've got our context for our database here. I dislike the fact that it did that. Not context. Thank you. Just a preference of mine. Normally, if it's coming into the parameters and being used, I prefer to camel case my stuff. I don't like using uppercases. So not context is what we're using, and not context dot value. You have to do dot value because of the fact it is an owned instance. So normally if you're doing link without the owned instance, you wouldn't need to do the dot value, but yeah. And then we're going to go with our credentials. And we're just going to select, and we're going to return them all. And we're going to assign them to a list, which just casts this to a list instead of an IEnumerable, which is what we have our list as. So now that we've got our credentials assigned, we're going to do something that is complete and total overkill, but I like to use this whenever I'm building models, which is parallel dot for each. So anybody who's done C++ program or anything like that knows parallelism and multi-threading can be a little bit of a pain. Parallel for each just lets you do a for each statement in parallel to fast build any object you need. So first we need to use our IntelliSense to bring it in. There's our system threading tasks for each, and we're going to use our credentials here. We're going to assign credential, and we're going to use a lambda setup. Lambda setup's basically like building an anonymous function inside of a function. So now we've got our lambda setup for the parallel for each. Now what we're going to use this parallel for each for is to build the objects that our response is reliant on. So we're actually going to go ahead and do a models.credential model, and we'll call it cred model or cred mod equal to new model credentials model. And we're just going to actually assign all of our values upon creation, which is what this piece here is letting us do. It's nice because it'll actually bring up which ones you haven't used yet. So we've got password equal to, port equal to, server equal to, and username equal to. All right. So there's that piece there. The next thing is we're going to have to assign that model to our response. Now this is not thread safe because we're adding to an object. So what we're going to do here is we're going to lock our response object. which says only one thread can actually access that response at any given time. And then we're going to do response.add. Sorry, credentials.add. And we're going to just add our cred mod. So now that add is thread safe, but it's letting us build all these items. So the actual assignment and the building of the items are all multi-threaded now, where the actually adding the model is still single thread at a time. So we've got our credential.password, and we're actually going to just copy the credential piece here and rely on the fact that IntelliSense is nice. So we'll do this. Paste it in. The period at the end says, hey, I'm looking to add something to the end of this, at which point you're going to pick what you're wanting to add, which in case we're assigning server to server, and username to username. All right. And just like that, so this is pulling creds from DB, building out response cred list. The last thing we need to do is say, hey, if I've made it this far in the application, I've succeeded. So response.success equal to true. All right, so that's it for this method inside of this class. Well, yeah, for this method. And we're actually going to copy the logic because it's going to be relatively similar for how we're setting up the next one too. Because we're going to use the parallel for each to build it. We're going to use all the rest of it. But instead of doing credentials, we're doing notification types. Notification types. And notification types. So we'll come down here, and instead of doing that, we're going to switch that to the notification types. We're going to assign our notification type. And just because it's going to trigger me. By the way, if you select up to this next line and you hit enter, it'll let it auto format. So it'll get your spacing right. So I'm going to change this to notification and notification. Again, it's not something I needed to do, but I'm just going to get rid of that piece. Building response list. I probably should have done that in the first place. So there we go. Now we don't have credentials anymore. We got notification types. So we're going to go ahead and paste this in here. And we're just going to call that notification. Not DB. There we go. So notification types from the database. And we don't need a credential model here. We need our notification type model. And again, we're going to head and set that to not mod. And it's not that I'm smart. I've got a lot of exposure to this. Honestly, a lot of this is relatively... I'm not going to say it's easy. It's just learning the syntax and letting IntelliSense do its thing to make sure you're not screwing up your case syntax or anything like that. So we've got our not model build here. Let's go ahead and just delete these out. And this is going to instead be notification types, and we're going to add not mod to it. There we go. All right. So now we're going to need our email format, our accepts HTML, and our notification type. And we're just going to pull those off the not model. Again, this is very overkill for this piece, but if you're ever having to build 40,000, 50,000 records fast, there are ways in Link to build them, but they function slow in comparison to doing a parallel for each. All right, so email format. And we're going to just copy this guy again. And we're going to do our accepts HTML, and we're going to do this piece, and we're going to do our notification type. All right. So now we have built our notification types from the database. We've got the database connection in. Next on is our factory that will actually handle building these. So we're going to go up to our factories, add class. This is going to just be I notification factory. Just like before, we're going to build our response request patterns. We're going to set this to internal to limit accessibility. Factory for building notifications. So your services should be performing logic. Your factory should handle building of objects. And we're going to do a new folder, and this is going to be factories. And we're going to add a class. So we're also going to have to expose the service at some point for another piece, but for now, this is going to actually build our messages. So this is going to be our message model. Our message model is going to have all the details we're going to need to forward onto the SMTP setup. So we've got our message model. Again, we're going to make it internal. Model holding details for an SMTP message. So what all do we need here? We're going to need a variety of stuff that we have elsewhere. We don't need notification type. We don't need email format. So none of this stuff needs to actually come in besides the HTML. So we're going to go to our message model, paste that down. It's not accepts HTML. It's going to be HTML message. And we'll leave that piece the same because it is still an indicator whether or not the email can have HTML as far as the markup goes. All right. Credential utility. We're actually going to need all of this because we're going to need all of it for setting up our SMTP. So we'll come down to the message, get all that. Now, what are we missing for actually sending the message? We need the actual message itself. So the message that's going to be in the email body. So we need to add that piece there. So internal string message get set message body for email. Internal string, and this is going to be the subject of the message. And I think all we have left is who we're going to be sending this message to. Subject for message, and then the last step is who are we sending this message to, which is going to be internal string recipient. There we go. Perfect. So that's going to be what we're passing back out of our factory. So now we need to go ahead and we're going to create a class of build message request. So what we're missing from the database for this request is the recipient, the notification type to actually set it, the subject, and the message. So that's going to be what we're expecting to be passed into the factory. So request for building a message. There we go. And it is going to, so we need our notification type, internal string notification type, get set type of notification to send. Internal string recipient. Recipient of message. And we're just going to copy pasta a little here to save some time. Because we've got two more strings that we got to bring in here. We've got the subject. Subject. And that's just the subject of the message. And then we've got the message contents. There's more you can do with this. You can add attachments. You can add a lot more stuff to it if you want to, as far as these go. But with it having the requirement that it be able to send an SMS, attachments may or may not go, depending on how they have it set up. So I'm just leaving this fairly dumb at this point. Message. So there's our request object. Then add class. We need our response object. So build message response. And we're going to just come to our services. We're going to copy and paste a little bit. You could also use inheritance to create a base response type and actually assign values based off of it. But for now, I'm just doing this, and we're going to make this internal. Build message response. Success, errors. Now, the big thing to change here is we're going to be instead using a message model. And we're not actually going to pass out a list. We're going to have a single solitary message model. Oop. We're not sending a ton of messages. We're sending a message. So, built message. All right. So now that we've got those defined, we're going to come to the factory here, and we're going to go build message response. Again, we're going to utilize our IntelliSense to actually set up the using statement. And we're going to call this build message, and we're going to have our build message request. And request. Method for building an SMTP notification message. Request with information on message to build. Why is it mad? Oh. I missed the interface. That's my bad. There we go. All right, and this is going to be success with message or errors. There we go. And now we're going to implement it. So add class notification factory. And this is going to be an internal class. Notification factory. We're going to implement the interface, which just sets our method there by default. We're going to snag our XML and just add it in real quick. I missed some wax on that. That's okay. We'll come back through and fix it real quick. There we go. So I'm missing a couple of wax here. There we go. All right. Now we need to create a public constructor for this because we're going to need to inject some dependencies. So we're going to have a private read-only, and it's going to be our IDBService. And we're going to do DbService We're going to underscore that. All right, there's that. Then we're going to go with our constructor. So we've got our public notification factory. Let me make sure I didn't mess up the DbService here. Again, needs to have a public constructor for autofac to inject. It's a thing. But we're still protecting it by doing the internal class. So yeah, public notification factory, and we're going to bring in our IDBService, DbService. We're going to assign the DbService to that. There we go. And now we have our DbService passed in. DbService. Constructor for notification factory. Passed in instance of DbService. Which again, this right here is just saying autofac implement this interface for me, pass in the details I need. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and go on to the next piece here. So just like before, we're going to use the build message response to new. We're going to initialize our response outside of a try catch. And just like that, we've got our response object done. Whoop. Don't put the semicolon in there. Semicolon should go at the end. Commas are for inside of there. And we're going to do our try. And we're going to catch. All right. And then we're going to return our response. Okay. Now let's go ahead and go back to the DbService real quick. We're going to snag our addition for our response error and reuse it up here. Perfect. All right. So now that we have that, we're going to need to call it to our database service to get some stuff. And we're going to need to do some validation here. So first we're going to do if quote request will equal to null. So if somebody did not pass in a request for us, we're going to throw a new exception. Valid request. So now what's going to happen if this actually ends up being true is it's going to hit here, say, oh, the request is null. It'll throw the exception, which will kick it. Come on. There we go. It'll kick it down to this exception base here. It'll set this piece here, and then I'll add that exception string we just created right to the end of it. So just an easy way of doing a validator. This is exceptionally helpful, especially when you're doing logging, because you don't want to have to do a long log statement and everything. You want to just have an easy way of handling that. So if request is not equal to null, we're going to continue on. So we've got a var. Let's go ahead and get our credentials first. So we're going to get a cred response. We're going to go to our DbService dot GetCredentials new. There we go. So we've got our cred response. Now we're going to validate what's passed back out. So if quote cred response equal null, if we got nothing out of it, or which that's what those double lines are there, is just an or statement. So for those of you new to C#, that's or, that's and. An or means if any of these are true, and and means all of these have to be true. So if cred response is null, always check the null first before you check anything else, because if you do not, you will trigger an exception checking a null value before you check the non-null attribute of it. So cred response dot success equal to false. So for false, or if we didn't succeed in it, or errors count, we're going to get the count of how many errors we have returned greater than 0. Apparently I don't need to use the, there we go. So if the response is null, if the response is not a success, or if the response has errors associated to it, we bombed. We need a throw. So we're going to do throw, new exception, and this is an invalid response. Response from DbService for getting credentials. Perfect. Let's get our next object now. So we've got our credential response. We now need our types response for our notification types. Equal to underscore DbService. Call our service, say get my notification types. New, we're going to set our request object. All right. And we're actually going to do the exact same validation. If anything went wrong at all, we're going to bomb. Now, thing to notice here is since we're returning lists out, we're going to have to do a little more validation after this. And we're actually going to use a little link here for those of you unfamiliar with it. For getting notification types. All right. So we've got a var creds. By the way, for those of unfamiliar, C# can be strongly typed, but by doing the var here, it'll just say, hey, whatever is set up over on the right side of the equals, that's what type I am. So DbService get notification types returns a notification type response. As a result, notification type response. So it just saves you from having to initialize those explicitly. You can do the generic var. Downside, takes away from readability. You can't glance at this code and know what the return type of GetCredentials is because it's not specified. So just throwing that out there. So we got var creds equal to. So we've got our cred response. We've got our credentials inside of our cred response. And what we're going to do here is just a first or default. All right. Now first or default is a link statement. So I'm going to have to add link, which this should actually pick it up. There we go. So what link does, it will says, give me the first item from the list or null. In the event there's nothing in the list, I can't find the first item, I'm null. So we have the next part of if creds equal to null. So we're ensuring our credentials aren't null. Throw new exception. No credentials returned from database service. All right, so now we've got our credentials set up. We're going to move on to getting the next item, which is we have to get our notification type. So we are going to do something very similar. So we're going to have var not type equal to. We've got our type response. So we've got our type response here. Dot notification types. And this time we're going to do first or default, but we're going to use some internal lambda. So we're going to have x goes to. So x is now a single instance of our notification type, and we want to do x dot equal notification type dot equals. And we're going to do the request dot notification type. And we're going to add a little thing here that is the string comparison dot invariant culture ignore case, which basically is I don't care what culture it came from, I don't care what case it is. If the basic of these two strings match, I'm going to use it. Now we're going to do the same check we did up above with the not type. And we're going to go ahead and this time throw a new exception again. Throw new exception. Could not find notification type. Perfect. All right. So now we've got our notification type, we've got our credentials. Now we need to actually build out the message inside our response. So response equal to, nope, there we go. So now we need to set each of these items here. Or we can do something that's a little easier. And this way it actually keeps track of what we haven't set yet. So we've got our response message equal to, and then we're going to go ahead and set our response equal to success here. Response.success. And I actually need to use the restroom real quick, so I'm going to be right back. Okay, I'm back. All right. So now we need to actually initialize our response object. So we've got the items in here. We're going to equal out. Perfect. All right. So now we just need to assign these variables real quick. So HTML message is going to come from our not type dot accepts HTML. Password, of course, is coming from our creds. And message is actually from our request object itself. Message. Port is from our creds. Recipient. Now this is actually going to be the tricky one, so I'm going to come back to that because we're going to do something a little special there. Subject is from our request. And username is from our creds. Okay. Now, for our recipient, we're actually going to take the option from our request.recipient. So what was passed in, and now we're going to add onto it our not type dot email format. And this should automatically provide the format we need to the end of the email. So whenever I created the database object for email itself, I did email with nothing for the column, so just a string empty. So nothing will get applied when it's an email, but in the event it's not an email, we pass in a number. It's going to attach the specialty email format for that given number. We said success, and just like that, we're done. Creds. Validate creds. Get types. Validate types. Cred. Use. Validate cred exists. Get type that corresponds to request type. Validate type found. There we go. Perfect, perfect, perfect. And there we go. All right. So that handles our factory.